Great. Well, thank you so much for having me. It's a real privilege to be with this group of scholars who are working in such an important area. So, my name is Jayashri Wyatt, and I am the Chief of Education Outreach in the Outreach Division of the Department of Global Communications at the United Nations. I sit in the Secretariat in New York. And one of the aspects of my portfolio and oversight is the strategic vision for the United Nations Academic Impact, which is also known as UNAI. And really, my focus is on revisioning the role of higher education within the sustainable development movement. I have an interest in ways of knowing diversity, equality, and inclusion, and decolonizing higher education institutions, and really also our own minds, so that we can approach the kind of urgent transformation that the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development calls all of us to. So just a tiny bit of background, if I may. The United Nations Academic Impact, it's a network of over 1,600 universities in over 150 countries that the United Nations supports. We support universities in their strategic alignment with the principles and the values of the UN and of the Sustainable Development Goals, really in research, teaching, engagement with communities, and especially with policymakers and practitioners. So it's really, truly an honor to be here as you're kicking off your Sustainable Development Goals in Higher Education project. So I'd just like to thank Dr. Kate Mawson and Professor Richard Hall for their invitation to be part of this really pivotal event as you're looking at creating these podcasts. So I just want to start with an image that I think helps us all to understand what the SDGs are really foundationally about. So seeing Earth from the vantage point of space with its ineffable and breathtaking beauty, the astronaut Ron Garan said this: looking back at our planet from space, it fills us with the realization that each and every one of us is riding through the universe together on the spaceship that we call Earth. We're all in this together. He called this perspective, some of you may know it, the orbital perspective. Looking at this organism that is clearly one living organism, how is it possible that there's so much conflict and inability to actually deal with some of these pressing challenges? And I think the orbital perspective really reminds us of our shared humanity and of our interconnected destiny on this planet that we call home. And an understanding that the challenges we face are not just local or regional issues, they're global in scale. They are local and they are regional, but they are intertwined. They are intersectional across the world. And I think part of the role of education is to encourage young people to see beyond their own lives and communities and to understand the broader world of interconnection and of our destiny that is also interconnected. I think higher education, all of you are representing here, it can be an amazing launch pad that has a unique capacity to propel minds into this kind of orbital perspective. And I think it's within universities and institutions of higher learning that we can foster awareness and identification with the notion of global citizenship, and thereby a passion for searching for the truth and a rigorous commitment to evidence-based research to help us to define what the truth is. So I think educators equip students with this kind of telescopic insight to see beyond immediate horizons and cultivate a microscopic attention to detail necessary for innovation and change. And I always argue that to be educated is to be transformed. And what I encourage us to think about is, what kind of global transformation are we seeking to educate for? I think in today's world, we see that truth is often contested. Misinformation, disinformation, hate speech are abounding on our social media platforms, in the news. Opinions are often leading antagonistic discourse that is fraught. And I think part of the role of academia is to also hold young people accountable for and to um, teach them about how to actually engage in conversation that is based on evidence and research. I think it's worth just taking a quick moment. I'm just trying to give you some food for thought to just take a moment to think about the Sustainable Development Goals. They are integrated, they are intersectional, they are transformational, and I would argue they're actually an existential proposition that is anchored in human rights principles. In 2015, the countries that make up the United Nations, they're known as member states, they adopted these sustainable development goals, also known as the global goals or the SDGs. There's 17 interlinked global goals. They're ambitious, with the world aiming to achieve these by 2030. And that's why we call it the 2030 Agenda. And the SDGs, and this I think is so important to recognize, they came out of one of the most far reaching and inclusive global consultations with the peoples of planet Earth in all of human history. It's truly historical. And the goals themselves of ending poverty, hunger, providing quality education to all, promoting gender equality, addressing climate change, ending inequality, just to name a few of them, when they're taken together, it's a blueprint for all of humanity, for peace, for prosperity, and for people on a healthy planet. And the historical adoption of these goals, which is about not leaving anyone behind, it demonstrates that international cooperation and consensus is possible, that there is so much more that unites us than divides us as a human family. These goals, as I was stressing, they're integral to one another, with the achievement of one goal impacting the achievement of others, or the lack of getting towards those targets impacting other goals. So, if we don't make significant progress on the empowerment of girls and women, then we will have enormous difficulty to achieve peace and security targets related to SDG 16, among others, or just readying the global workforce or eliminating poverty. And studies show us, just as one example, that in countries with high levels of gender inequality, we see that these cultures and societies and states are much less likely to experience conflict. So, really getting at the intersectionality and the way that these are interconnected is so crucial. UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres also explained that, quote, the SDGs are not just a list of goals. They carry the hopes and dreams, rights, and expectations of people everywhere, end quote. These goals, again, they represent an existential proposition. It is a call to action for humanity. And I submit to you that our collective survival may depend in part, and perhaps large part, on whether or not we are able to achieve these goals. Well, how are we doing? You guys probably know a little bit about this, but let me just tell you, we are halfway to our 2030 deadline. This September at the SDG summit, which was called by the Secretary General, we estimate that we're only 15% of the targets are on track for the SDGs. There are many that are going in reverse. We're witnessing absolutely unprecedented conflict, driving record numbers of people from their homes alongside deadly fires, floods, soaring temperatures. Poverty, inequality, injustice, mistrust, division, and prejudice are on the rise. So the world is really at a crisis point, with people in our planet suffering immensely. Failure to achieve these goals will lead to further political instability and displacement, further eroding trust in public institutions, disrupting economies, and causing irreversible damage to our natural environment that supports and sustains all life. The impact, of course, is always more costly and profound for the most vulnerable and the poorest people and countries. And these divisions that I'm talking about, these conflicts, these pressing challenges, the environmental crisis, these are testing the limits of international cooperation and multilateralism. So, well, why do the SDGs matter to higher education? I've got a bit of a captive audience. You're here to do podcasts on the SDGs, so I fully appreciate that you're already engaged. But I just want to say a few things about this to help, I think, deepen your practice as you're going into this work that you're doing. The 2030 agenda, with its goals, its enablers, its indicators, and its targets, again, it isn't just a numbers game. It's not simply about looking at the data, providing science and evidence-based research, and parlaying that into policy and practice. If only it was that easy. I'm certainly not diminishing this part of the work of the agenda, but we must also recognize that the 2030 agenda at its core is fundamentally about transformation of our world, our mindsets, the way we do things. Transformation is not a simple pursuit because it not only requires institutional and systemic transformation, it also requires human transformation, behavior change on our part. And human beings are adapting all the time. In the Western world, rich countries have adapted to new technologies like computers and iPhones, artificial intelligence, chat GPT, the ubiquitous of social media, and also to some of the uglier sides of things, like the fact that many people are suffering from serious mental health issues that are rising up from this social media use and consumption. And young people's mental health is suffering. A European study, for example, found that women are 27 times more likely to face harassment online than men. And another analysis found that 92% of women reported that online violence negatively impacts their well-being. Making individual change, like just say becoming a vegetarian, or buying an electric car, or limiting your air travel, because doing these things is far better for the environment. But in economic systems that are not incentivized to encourage an energy transition away from fossil fuel requires a lot of personal effort. And I would argue that as you're thinking about your podcast, we need to focus on the solution side in a systems approach that creates the necessary incentives to fundamentally address the pressing existential challenges of our time. But still remembering that even in systems approaches, human transformation, as I'm arguing, is the way we think, perceive the world, behave. These are still required, but that's not simple or easy, you know? Human transformation, just ask anyone who's tried to lose 5 pounds. Changing your behavior is not an easy proposition. So there's a human element here that we have to acknowledge. One of the best definitions that I've read about what it means to be human is asserted by Paulo Freire in his book, The Pedagogy of the Oppressed. I think it's out of print. Shouldn't be. He argues that the goal of being human is to become more fully human. He suggests that as human beings, we must strive to evolve, to transcend, to transform ourselves in order to transform forms of oppression. And indeed, the culture, the societies, the institutions, and our educational institutions to create the world that we want to inhabit. Well, what does it mean? What does it mean for scholars and universities and institutions to be intentionally, consciously, and strategically part of a transformative global agenda for humanity and of ourselves? How does transformation in human society and culture usually occur? What are the most effective ways to engage in transformation of our institutions and our economic and political structures? And how do we make sure that once we make gains to transform, that our institutions don't backslide? Our track record as human beings is pretty poor. Our cruelty and our penchant for violence, domination, division, chaos, it's well documented. What does it mean to be human and to live at a time of massive existential stress and uncertainty? I'm just raising these questions here. I don't necessarily have the answers for all of these, but I think it's important, again, to look at some of the more ineffable parts of the work of transformation and this global agenda. So, just turning now to a more tactical and strategic side, we do have many of the solutions and the innovations already. It's the how, it's the political will, it's the necessary investments to implement these tactical and strategic solutions that are most often missing in action. The one thing that we do know, and as scholars, I'm just raising this up, is that education is a master key for transformation. The Education for Sustainable Development in SDG, its target 4.7, has been recognized by the UN General Assembly as, quote, a vital means of implementation for sustainable development. It's a key enabler of all of the other sustainable development goals. And the other thing I wanted to raise up to you, as well as scholars and working in university institutions, is that according to Mader, Scott, and Razak in their article, Effective Change Management, Governance and Policy for Sustainable Transformation in Higher Education, their research showed that about 6.7% of the world has a college degree, but more than 80% of the decision makers in industry, community, and politics have one. So again, the role of higher education is so significant to the proposition of transformation of the SDGs. And I would say again that to be educated is a fundamental human right. This is part of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. This is the 75th anniversary of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And yet, in so many places, many young people do not even get to go to primary school. Globally, 129 million girls are out of school. 129 million girls. 49% of countries have achieved gender equity in primary education. That's half. That's half of the countries of planet Earth have managed to achieve gender equity in primary education. At the secondary education level, the gap widens to 42% in lower secondary and only 24% in upper secondary. Globally, 16% of children and youth covering primary to upper secondary are not attending school. At primary level, 1 out of every 10 children worldwide are not in school. It's a master key, education is. To be educated is to be transformed. But in so many places, education, and particularly higher education, is becoming more of a privilege rather than a right. And if these young people that I'm telling you about, those 129 million girls who are out of school, cannot even get primary school education, how can they possibly consider thinking about post-secondary education? So I'm telling you this because you're scholars and you're educators. So this is part of problem solving and looking at what is it that we can do to help to create those solutions. At the Transforming Education Summit, which was called by UN Secretary General last September in 2022, recognizing this global crisis in education, it's one of equality, of inclusion, of quality, and relevance. The Youth Declaration urged decision makers to, quote, to decolonize and democratize knowledge production, pedagogy, and learning by improving and mandating curricula that dismantle colonial, racist, misogynistic, and other discriminating attitudes, as well as recognizing the value of indigenous and local knowledge, end quote. So I think, again, as you're working on these podcasts, it's really critical to be thinking about what kind of future and what kind of transformation are we educating for? How can we expand access to formal education? Are we currently educating with an intentional purpose aimed at creating leaders, thinkers, and innovators that will be able to bring about a more inclusive and more peaceful, healthy world for all generations to come? This particular gathering of scholars is giving me a tremendous sense of hope that you are all engaging with the SDGs and that you are considering how you can create impact through academia, academic impact. Universities, I think, at a baseline are a place where human intellect is challenged, it's transformed, it's shaped. And perhaps at best, it's a place where young people and burgeoning scholars, they're reimagining themselves and their scholarship entirely, emotionally, socially, and intellectually. Universities are contributing already in a positive way to the development of their students, but this is a significant responsibility that universities have. And I would argue that the SDGs need to be baked into the DNA of your scholarship, of your university institutions. In higher education, it must become an integral part of learning, knowledge acquisition, research exploration, and global citizenship. The United Nations Academic Impact Initiative, and indeed the member states of the United Nations, are convinced of the enormous transformative potential that higher education institutions, HEIs, must and are already playing in the future of our planet and the realization of the SDGs. It's kind of difficult to overstate the importance of universities and colleges and higher education to the realization of the SDGs. Higher educations, through their research, their learning, their teaching, their campus operation and leadership, they reach hundreds of millions of learners at all stages of their life across a multitude of disciplines. Because universities are in such a unique position, they therefore have a critical responsibility to lead on the SDGs, to rise up to the global challenges through institutionalizing partnerships with governments and communities that educate for the SDGs, and to align and weave the SDGs into the governance, operation, academic cultures of pedagogy, teaching, and research. So, what I will just say is that a key piece for me is that gap really between the research and the policy making and the practice. And there are some scholars who have argued, Fadi El-Jardali, Jura Ataya, and Rasha Fadlala. They argue in the changing roles of universities in the era of SDGs that policy decisions to meet the Sustainable Development Goals have got to be informed by policy relevant evidence that's co-designed and co-produced with the pertinent stakeholders, taking into consideration local and political context. And universities are uniquely placed, once again, to lead this kind of cross-sectoral implementation of the SDGs to advance the 2030 agenda. These scholars that I just mentioned argued the case for building, strengthening, and institutionalizing university partnerships with governments and communities to achieve the SDGs. They call for change in mindsets and culture in academia and in government, and they invite those parties to start the dialogue with one another. And what we see in the United Nations Academic Impact is that when universities are working directly with local governments, they tend to be able to get to solutions quickly and they get to implementation very quickly. And what we see sometimes is when universities are working, say, with federal governance, it can inform policy making, but we see implementation happening quicker when it's local. So I just want to bring up that point about getting very localized in the work that you're planning to do. And we see that this kind of symbiotic relationship between the SDGs and academia can be very powerful. And I'm just going to give you, there's two universities that I'll just point out that are doing some really excellent work in the UNAI, and that's DMU, the De Montfort University, which Richard is from, where I've had the chance to visit, but I know there are other scholars who belong to the UNAI, and also Carnegie Mellon University. And these universities have started doing mappings of their courses, of having sustainability offices built into the structure of their academia. And of their strategic priority making. And so I think when we see that universities take that strategic approach, what it does is there's activist scholars like yourself who are already doing this in your own area of scholarship. But what we really see is huge differences can be made when university administrations make a decision to do this across the university. That is game changing. So I just wanted to raise that up as well. So what we see again is that across universities and scholarship, we see that engagement with the SDGs, it's a bit uneven. And so we hope that we can work much more closely with universities and scholars to ensure that there is much more strategic engagement with university presidents, provosts, and at the strategic level. So I just want to sum up some of the ideas here for your thinking. The first thing is that the Sustainable Development Goals, it's existential work. It's an existential proposition. It's a human imperative that you're working on. So as you're working on your podcast, I think to keep it in that frame of being grounded in human rights and of being existentially significant is one of the things that I encourage you to really think about. The second thing that I just want to add as well is that the Sustainable Development Goals, they're integral, they're interconnected, they're intersectional, just as all life is inextricably interconnected and our human destiny is interwoven. Those interconnections are crucial as you're thinking about this work. As I also mentioned, education is a key enabler of all the other sustainable development goals. So whatever area you're working in, how you are, creating that multiplier effect so that you're continuing to educate communities or governance, that is crucial as well. The fourth thing I wanted to say is that in summing up this particular section is that developing the values and the principles that underpin the SDGs are almost as critical as the knowledge production, research, data collection, and analysis to inform that evidence-based policy making and practice. The value of multilateralism, the value of discourse, it is crucial to actually being able to implement solutions. Higher education specifically, I think, needs to become much more intentional and focused about the implementation of the SDGs into the strategic planning of universities, the curriculum, teaching, engagement with policymakers, as I mentioned. And I think the last thing that's important to recognize, especially in, say, Global North, is that all institutions and all countries are part of the sustainable development work. We're all in development. We're all in the act of transformation. This is an endeavor that I think development in the UN context has, historically been about. We're the global north. We have the solutions. Global South is in development and burgeoning, and we have the solutions for you, and you are the problem. And actually, that kind of development is giving way, I think, now to more and more of an understanding that we are all in sustainable development together. And that goes back to that first piece, which is it's an existential proposition. So I'm encouraging you to also think about access. How can more young people get access to what you're doing, to these podcasts. I hope that they're going to be free and available because access is really key. Second, inclusion. Who are we including in these conversations? Who needs to be in those conversations? The third thing is, what is your transformational proposition? How are you proposing to do transformation in whatever SDG you are looking at from a scholarship, point of view? Partnership. Who are the partners that you need to work with in order to do this transformation work that you're proposing as well? And lastly, what's that policy practice piece, right? How are you going to get that over the line utilizing your transformation work and the partners that you're working on? What kind of practice needs to change? And what kind of policy making needs to happen in order for that practice to also change? Practitioners can start working right away. Policy sometimes takes longer to change. So, a couple of other things that I want to encourage you to think about. I think that most learning is often about listening. Can you create the space, in the kind of education that you are working on and scholarship for listening to be a key part and listening with empathy to those who perhaps you may disagree with? The second thing I think we need to think about is dialogue and discourse. Are we also engaging and teaching young people? Are we modeling in our scholarship the value also of intercultural dialogue, right? UNESCO recently, well, not so recently, maybe in 2022, released a report called Let's Talk about Intercultural Dialogue. And again, we just saw across the board, when that kind of intercultural dialogue happens in countries, they have so much less strife and less conflict in their countries. So are we actually working on that as well? Curiosity. Are we developing a sense of curiosity in our own scholarship and in the young people that we work? And the last thing I would say is that I think those that we're engaging with as scholars, students come with their own experiences. Are we creating a place of value for that as well? And the last few things that I'll leave you with are problem solving. This is a big part of the transformational work that we're doing. And I think these are simple questions that we ask when we're doing problem solving. Like, why is this a problem? What can we do about it? But I think there's another question there is who is best positioned and what groups are best positioned to help find those solutions? In the UN, of course, peacekeeping was largely done by men and it was dominated by men. And we're discovering now that women in peacekeeping is absolutely critical to being able to solve conflict. So in your own conversations and the dialogue and the discourse that you're hoping to create out of these podcasts, these are again some of the things that I hope you can convey. I think we also need to think about thinking. Are we thinking in a magnanimous and a generous and an inclusive way? So again, who needs to be in those conversations? Are we leaving anybody out of conversations? I think we also need to teach young people, and our conversations need to be thinking about the role of power. What systematic assumptions, written and unwritten rules, are determining the conversations we have? And then the last thing is futures. I think we also have to think about, as we're creating discourse and conversation and educational propositions with students and young people, how do we prepare them to be ready for the challenges that we don't yet even know exist, and the kinds of unintentional consequences that sometimes arise from some of the solutions that we propose. So I think that futures lens is very, very important to be thinking about as you're doing this as well. So, um, some of you may also be thinking about how can I stay connected more with the United Nations? And if that's something that you're interested in, I just wanted to say here that please, you can connect with me. I'll drop my email in the chat. It's wyatt@un.org. If you want to join the United Nations Academic Impact, if you think your university would be interested and you're not already a member, we're really happy to work with you. It's a very easy process. It is free, and we are very interested in staying connected with you or your institutions. The second thing is that we have a guideline called the UNESCO UNA Guidelines for the SDGs, where we have laid out exactly how universities can engage with the 2030 agenda. We propose very specific steps like developing of a conceptual framework and a sustainability strategy and the implementation of unique governance and tailored mechanisms to review the actions and mapping of courses and projects for the SDGs. We'll share that in the chat as well. I just want to flag for your students. There's an amazing group that we partner with. They're called the Millennium Campus Network. 4,000 students graduated this year from the Millennium Campus Network. And this is undergrads and graduate students who take on an SDG project over the course of a year, and they work it into their academic studies. And we're just seeing that about 80% of the young people who graduate from this program, once they enter the workforce, about 80% of them are still engaged in social impact work after they leave that program. So this is a program that we're super proud of, and we'd love to share that with you as well. I'm also flagging that the Secretary General has called for the Summit of the Future. And this is happening September 2024. Now, this is a member state-led summit and process, but there are always days when civil society and specifically academia is invited to participate, usually for about 2 days over the weekend before it happens. So we will keep you informed about that if that's something you want to continue to engage with. And maybe there's a way that we can look at the podcast. I'm not sure where they're going to and when, if the timelines line up, but it's something that we should be thinking about. And then the other thing is we'll also share this link with you. The Office of the President of the General Assembly is usually putting out every year the goals for the UN General Assembly. So if this is something that you're interested in taking a look at, then we can share that with you as well. And then the last thing I'll flag is the Sustainable Development Solutions Network. This is Jeffrey Sachs's outfit out of the Earth Institute at Columbia University here in New York. But SDSN is seeking to foster joint learning and aims to bridge the gap between technical expertise and policy formulation. So the podcast may be something that they'll be really interested in as well. So I just wanted to flag those things. Just going to close with a couple of other thoughts for you. Aristotle believed that the purpose of scholarship was to develop and exercise students' potential for reasoning, form ethical character, and provide a skill and knowledge base. Bell Hooks argued in her 1994 book, Teaching to Transgress, Education as the Practice of Freedom. And she said, quote, "The academy is not paradise, but learning is a place where paradise can be created. The classroom, with all its limitations, remains a location of possibility. In that field of possibility, we have the opportunity to labor for freedom, to demand of ourselves and of our comrades an openness of mind and heart that allows us to face reality even as we collectively imagine ways to move beyond boundaries to transgress. This is education as the practice of freedom, end quote. And I think that's very informative as we're thinking about transformation and decolonizing the way that we do education. And today, I also think about the women and girls who are forbidden to go to school or to university. We met with one of our partners in Tehran, and they were telling us how they were taking Afghan women, refugees, who would then be able to study after leaving Afghanistan. And I'm thinking about Malala Yousafzai, who was shot at point blank range just for advocating for girls' education. And I think, this kind of extreme act of violence, attempting to silence somebody who's simply trying to become educated, it really speaks of the power, the transformative power of education, and how significant what you do as scholars actually is. And Malala also said, and I think this echoes what Bell Hooks is saying as well, truly believe the only way we can create global peace is through not only educating our minds, but of our hearts and our souls. I think this SDGs and higher education project, your podcasts, represent a very exciting journey. And I'm really honored to be here. And I hope that I've given you some food for thought as you're going into your work. And I will leave it there. And I'm happy if anybody has any questions or thoughts.
Yeah, Sri, that was wonderful. My alarm just went off as well to kind of tip you the wink about timing. So it was great timing. In particular, I think it's important for us to be, or for me, it feels important for me to be reminded that this is intentional, that there is an intent here. So we've definitely got it. Kate, are there any questions in the chat, or should I call Charlotte in?
I think call Charlotte, Richard.
Charlotte, have you got a question or a point?
Yes, I do. Thank you. Can you hear me okay? Great. Thank you so much for that inspiring talk. I've written 2.5 pages of notes. Thank you very much. Yeah, I'm Charlotte Jones from the Centre for Lifelong Learning at the University of Warwick, and 2 points that you've raised really struck me. Well, loads of them did, but 2 particularly in relation to the work that we do. You were saying about access is key, and who are we including? And our whole remit within the Centre for Lifelong Learning is supporting students who may have had the experience of education or lack of that you described in terms of access previously, but who have incredibly found the courage to engage in learning within higher education, which is no easy process for them. And we support them to engage in degrees, and they do incredibly well. So for me, there was something there that you were talking about that's actually really important to emphasize in terms of our adult learners who are coming back to education and the impact of that on sustainable communities, economic growth, and so on. So I just wanted to emphasize that as a sort of response to what you were saying. That's obviously an area that I'm passionate about, and how we can support them further, really.
Thank you very much, Charlotte. It's so lovely to hear all of the work that's going on out in the world. I think, as I said, just to reiterate, as educators and scholars, you have such a significant role to play. It's hard to measure too. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you, Charlotte. Kate.
We've got a question in the chat. Unfortunately, Sylvie's not afraid to, isn't able to use her microphone, but asks, she'd like to hear your thoughts in relation to how mobility might play a role in mediating access and equity in global HE. Do you have any thoughts, Jayshree, about mobility for Sylvie?
Yeah, I'm just wondering what if you can be a bit more specific about how and what sense you mean mobility in.
So I'll wait and see if Sylvie can
If Sylvie's able
expand a
to
little bit on that
to
in the
say a
chat.
little bit.
Thinking about student mobility in tertiary education.
Like you're talking about the possibility of moving from educational institutions from one to another. Is that what you're talking about? Yeah,
Yes,
okay, and
yeah.
across border. Okay, I just wanted to make sure that I understood correctly your meaning. Oh, here, I will add, I'm just adding my yeah. Well, I think yeah, mobility is definitely something that impacts, not only students trying to study, especially when I think you're talking about cross border as well. It can really be difficult. But I do think that this is something that Jeffrey Sachs has been talking a lot about, and it's something that we're working on here at UNAI, which is again access and equity in global higher education. The more that we can offer free courses, the better the world is going to be. And I'll just say that the SDSN is launching in February a huge set of courses on sustainable development that will be entirely free. But I think there are still important, that's not the only answer. It's part of the answer. And I think the more that universities and higher education can do that, the better. But I think, the equity issue and the access issue, we see in some countries that young people living in their own countries are shut out because of financial. Um, it's just a huge barrier to entry, and the scholarships are not there. And so I think this is something that we have to work at with the governments, because of course I think you live in a country where young people can access they have less financial burden than say in other countries. But this is something that we have to work on with the member states. And it's really comes down to how much of your gross national product and how much of your tax base are you willing to spend on education. And I think that that argument just simply has to be made, that it's such a cheap investment to invest in education and to educate your citizenry, and being able and being and creating that access for your students in your own country and for them to be able to travel and study in other countries is absolutely critical. And I think the private sector and civil society has a role to play here as well in certain contexts to create scholarship, etc. But I do think that the primary responsibility still lies with national governments. So I hope that is answering your question.
Were there any more questions, Kate? I think we've kept Jay Ashry here 50 minutes, and it's been super interesting. Mary Claire. Let's make this the last one, and then we'll wind up and move to the podcast. Mary Claire, you're up.
Sorry you can't see me. I'm just gonna. Can you see me now? Oh, okay. Well, it's just that when the Labour government had the target of, what was it, 50% of 18 to 30-year-olds in higher education by, was it 2030? So I'm at the University of Greenwich, which is very much a widening participation institution. I know a lot of my colleagues were quite cynical, partly because they felt that young people were getting into debt, and was this really a valuable investment for them? So was this necessarily the most appropriate path for them? So I just wanted to kind of push back a bit on this. And it's not that I don't, you know, obviously I think university is really important and the liberal arts as much as vocational subjects. But, you know, this was the kind of talk that was going on. And of course, there is more push to have apprenticeships now. So perhaps you could, maybe you're including technical vocational training as well. So yeah, I'd love to hear your thoughts on this. And of course, this agenda has sadly declined anyway. But yeah.
Yeah, no, definitely. I think technical training as well is absolutely critical, and we see this across the globe. And yes, in today's day and age, I mean, you're talking about the British context and the political context that's shaping these kinds of policy decisions around education, but we certainly see that in many countries globally. But, you know, from my standpoint, there is a distinct responsibility that governments have, especially in democratic situations, to create the necessary, you know, tools, support, institutions, and investments for young people to be trained. There's no greater investment that a government can actually make. And yeah, I just would not back away from that particular position. But I do think, to my earlier point, we do have to understand why there are some people who say, oh, you know, post-secondary education is not a good investment. It's a waste of time. You know, I met with some people who thought that as well, and they're entrepreneurs. And so I think there has to be space in our economies and our cultures and societies to both, you know, understand that, you know, certain routes, there have to be different routes for all kinds of different sectors of our economies and our societies. But to say that it's not a good investment, I just don't find that to be a compelling argument. I think this is the responsibility of governments to educate its citizens in whatever way, you know, makes sense, and to be innovating in how we're able to educate our citizens. There's certainly a huge amount of unofficial, informal education that goes on all the time, you know, on the internet now. People are watching videos about how to make bombs. They're also watching videos about how to make great cakes. But still, formal education is critical in my view, because it speaks to the kind of culture we want to create and the kind of discourse that we need to have with one another. So in any case, I hope that answers your question,
yeah, that's great.
Mary
And
Claire.
thank you so much for the talk. And I just wanted to highlight that some of my research is on the history of our institution, which was Woolwich Polytechnic. And over 100 years ago, in 1900, Sidney Webb, who you may have heard of, the Fabian Society, was promoting, through the funding available for technical instruction, he was actually promoting routes for young people to go from state-funded elementary schools to London University and other forms of higher, tertiary education. And that kind of discourse about, you know, the humanities are a waste of time was not around. You know, this in the minute books, it actually talks about the importance of the liberal arts. So anyway, this is just a plea for the importance of history, and so we don't kind of, you know, just go on this very instrumental route. Anyway, thanks so much. That was a fantastic talk. And our Institute for Life Course Development is kind of founded on the SDGs. So I'll pass this all back. Thank you.
Thanks, Mary Claire. That's great. Jayashri, we're going to wind up your section there. That was really, really insightful.